Welcome to the Kenneth N. Trueblood Award. This year is given to Airlie McCoy. So the Trueblood Award was established to recognize exceptional achievement in computational or chemical crystallography. It's in memory of Professor Kenneth N. Trueblood, who was a professor at UCLA and a major force in the early use of computers and crystallographic software. His research work has also been recognized as significant and contributing to Nobel Prizes awarded to Dorothy Hodgkins for vitamin B12 and to Donald Cram's work on host-guest complexes. Many of us may know Ken Trueblood more fondly as the co-author of Crystal Structure Analysis, a primer co-written with Jenny Glusker. So the award has been given to Airlie McCoy in recognition of her key contributions to one of the most important macromolecular crystallographic software packages for phase determination, and that's the program Phaser. Roughly since 2010, 50% of structures deposited in the PDB have been solved using Phaser. So Airlie's contribution is not only to the phasing of macromolecular crystal structures, but also to the field of macromolecular crystallography itself. And this, I believe, will become a higher percentage of structures solved by Phaser now that we have such new and exciting opportunities that have opened up as a result of AlphaFold. So today, her lecture is being given remotely. The title of it is Molecular Replacement, Past, Present, and Future.
Hello. I need to start by apologizing for not being there with you in Portland today. Unfortunately, there are a few different reasons for my absence, each of which was pretty insurmountable on its own, but together they just made it impossible. I know I'm missing out on a lot by not being there, and I hope you're all having a lot of fun. It is, of course, a huge honour to receive the Kenneth N. Trueblood Award, and extremely, genuinely unexpected. And I thank the ACA Awards Committee for their consideration and for their generosity. I also thank Professors Elspeth Garman, Isabel Usson, and Sasha Uzumshev for nominating me, and also particularly Elspeth and Isabel for their support in both my scientific and my personal life. I also thank the numerous crystallographers, as I have been led to believe, who wrote in support of the nomination. It's no small thing to take time out from your day to write a solicited letter with all the demands on your time, and I have to say it's just the knowledge that these commendations exist that's the most humbling part of the award. It's undeniably nice to know that your work is appreciated by people whose opinion you value, even if it is in an anonymous, abstract sense. I'd also like to say that, well, I don't really have a good word for it. Perhaps preposterous covers it. To think that my name is now on a list with Tom Twilliger and Axel Brunner, who are two heroes of protein crystallographic software. So I guess Randy Reed and myself together are mostly known for a program called Phaser. And I want to lay here a rumour to rest. The name has nothing to do with Dr. McCoy and Star Trek.
What's a phaser?
A type of program. Unfortunately, it does not function in the presence of hyperonic radiation. I will have to be innovative.
You're using your own neural subprocessors to build a smarter phaser.
Essentially correct.
Yes, so what is Phaser? Phaser slots into the protein crystallography process. So if we take a holistic view, we start with protein purification, then crystallization, data collection, density interpretation, and structure validation and refinement. And Phaser sits here at the solution of the phase problem. If we further subdivide the phasing process into Fourier methods, molecular replacement, and experimental phasing, then phaser deals with molecular replacement and one of the experimental phasing methods, which is SAD phasing. So phaser was first released on the 6th of September 2003, after about 2 years of work to get to that point, starting from the time when Randy moved from Canada to the University of Cambridge, Department of Haematology, and I also moved to the Department of Haematology, but only from the LMB, which is about half a mile away. It was the first piece of software that I had released, and I admit it was extremely nerve-wracking. I was so worried about it that I hardwired a kill switch into the first release so that it would die on the 1st of January 2004 and just quietly vanish into the ether if it was just too awful for people to use in the real world. But I swear on my PhD thesis that I will never put a kill switch in software again, because we were getting some nice feedback about it straight out of the gate, and consequently many vigorous complaints when it died on that 1st of January. Our downloads, which we were managing ourselves, went up a lot after our first endorsement on the CCP4 Bulletin Board, which was from Andy Perkis. And then there was this, posted to the CCP4 Bulletin Board on the 7th of July 2004. Needless to say, that coming from George, we were stunned.
Put your phaser on stop.
So why was phaser making such an impact? Well, phaser was one of a number of new programs at the time that leveraged the ever-increasing computational power of computers to implement maximum likelihood methods, supplanting least squares approaches like the ones described by Kenneth N. Trueblood in his book with Jenny Glusker. So to illustrate the sort of phasing environment that phaser was being developed in, I thought I would read a couple of very short sections from my PhD thesis, because my thesis discusses the things that didn't work as well as the things that did work. And of course, that sort of information is harder to come by in the literature. So my thesis is a weighty tome. My PhD supervisor, Peter Coleman's famous quote was, "If it was easy, you wouldn't learn anything." And I certainly learned a lot in the course of my thesis. I'm going to talk about two structures, LIF and WBA1. LIF is a 4-helix bundle cytokine. We had monoclinic crystals of the murine protein, good data, 2 angstroms, and there were 2 in the asymmetric unit. Winged spleen albumin 1 is a seed storage protein. We had tetragonal crystals, 1.8 angstrom data, and there was 1 in the asymmetric unit. So firstly, LIF. It starts with a discussion of the most important phasing method at the time, which was MIR phasing. But that didn't work, so we'll skip over that bit. And then it talks about the molecular replacement. The model with the highest sequence identity to LIF at the time was GCSF, but that was only 11% sequence identity, so it would be a challenge even today. It then talks about the 4 models that were built from GCSF. Now, 3 of those 4 seem completely crazy with what we know now about where the signal comes from in molecular replacement. The one that made sense was cutting the molecule down to the upper helical core of the structure. But the other 3 were the full structure, including the loops, which were never going to contribute signal, the C alpha trace of the structure, which had hardly any scattering, and a homology model of LIF based on the GCSF structure, which probably took the coordinates further away from the LIF structure than the GCSF coordinates themselves. So then it comes to running the rotation functions, and that was done in Explorer. It talks about manually setting the sampling angle for the rotation function at 1 degree, and it also talks about manually setting the radii for the Patterson, so 20, 25, 30, and 35 angstroms, no automatic determination of the distance. It also talks about using different resolution ranges, 3 angstroms, 4 angstroms, 5 angstroms, and 6 angstroms. Now, with what we know now about where the signal comes from in molecular replacement, it seems crazy to be cutting the resolution back so far, but at the time, the logic was that we had a very distant model, so we should be making them look more similar by only looking at them at low resolution. Unfortunately, there was no signal in the cross-rotation function, so what to do? Patterson correlation refinement. So the idea of the Patterson correlation refinement was to take a large number of peaks from the cross-rotation function and to try to find which of those might be the correct orientation by optimizing the orientation of the helices, the 4 helices, separately by refining them rotationally independently. And I love this line from my thesis. It says, in most cases, the packing of the 4 helix bundle was totally disrupted. So that was an abject failure. But then we were scooped. The structure of human lymph was determined in Oxford. Great, now we had an identical model for murine lymph. This should be dead easy. But it's really interesting. It wasn't, even with an identical model. So it now talks about running the cross-rotation function. And there were 2 molecules in the asymmetric unit, and the 2 peaks were at 6.3 sigma and 3.5 sigma. Okay, so we've got a very weak cross-rotation function solution running the translation function now manually. There was no way of building up the solution by placing one and then the second molecule, so the 2 molecules of lymph had to be searched for in separate translation functions. In the first translation function, the signal was 10.3 sigma, and in the second one, it was only 5.8 sigma. So now we had to find out the relative position of these 2 molecules. That was 4 one-dimensional translation functions, and the signal for one of them came out as a correlation coefficient of 0.38 and an R factor of 42%. So I find that amazing that we had almost an identical model, and yet the molecular replacement was not trivial in this case, even then. So now I'm going to talk about WBA1. It starts again with the most important phasing technique, which is MIR phasing. And it talks about collecting 26 derivatives, of which 4 of those I could find sites for. They weren't independent. There was some anomalous signal, but that was only used to determine the hand of those derivatives, not in the phasing. And the refinement was done as SIR phasing for all of those, and then the combined at the end to make an MIR map. The MIR map was not traceable, so then we go on to molecular replacement. There were 3 models available for WBA1, and we went through the same process as was done with LIF, but this time there was a peak in the cross-rotation function. Unfortunately, I couldn't take that rotation function peak and get a signal in any translation function that I ran. Now that seems amazing to me now, because there's so much more signal in a maximum likelihood translation function than there is in a rotation function. But that's what the methods were giving me at the time. So what to do? Combine the information from the MIR and the molecular replacement. That meant doing a phased translation function. And I remember setting that up. I remember the difficulty that I had setting it up at the time, but I also remember the excitement at the results because it was an 18 sigma peak. And I'd never seen a signal in anything that I had done. The molecular replacement, the MIR phasing, Harker section searches, I'd never seen a signal of at 18 sigma for the whole of my thesis. So that was a very good day. So this is Phase's original translation function target, the LLG. I'm sure it would have made really short work of the WBA1 translation function. I still like to explain it to people because if you have a concept of what's going on in this function, even though it can look quite intimidating, maybe, but the concepts within it are quite simple, and if you understand them, then you don't have to read the manual because it's all there, it's all in the function. We now actually use the LLGI, which is the log likelihood gain in intensity, which is an expansion of the original target function to include information about the error in the data as well as the error in the model. So many years ago, I wrote a paper called Liking Likelihood, which explained the concepts behind these functions and the other functions in phasor with dice. I still think it's a good way of explaining what's going on. So this is just a quick overview, and by the end of it, I promise you will understand the equation that I just showed you on the previous slide. So let's talk about a game of dice with some data. So if we put 4 unbiased dice in the box, a 4-sided die, a 6-sided die, an 8-sided die, and a 10-sided die, and you select one of the die at random, you obviously have a 1 in 4 chance of guessing which one has been selected. But if I roll the die and tell you the result of the roll, then you have some more information and you have a better idea of which die was likely to be the one that was selected. So let's do the experiment, shall we? And Data's rolled 10, so it's very obvious which die it was that was selected. Must have been the 10-sided die. Let's try again. Okay, now he's rolled a 7. So it could have been the 8-sided die or the 10-sided die that rolled the 7. But it's more likely that the 7 was rolled from the 8-sided die than the 10-sided die. So if we do this experiment often enough, we're more likely to get the right selection rather than just guessing at random. And that's true even if data rolls a 1, which could have come from any of the die. So how do we express that mathematically? Well, if it was a 10-sided die, then it's a 1 in 10 chance of it coming from a 10-sided die, but 0 probability of coming from the rest, so it must have been the 10-sided die. The 7, we have 1 in 10 and 1 in 8, so most likely the 8-sided die. And for the 1, 1/4 chance that it came from the 4-sided die, so that was the one we would be guessing and would be guessing right more often than random. Well, our data are FOBs, normalized as EOBs, and our model is the FCalc, not the atomic coordinates directly. Okay, let's try this again, and this time data is going to give us more data. Okay, rolls a 6, rolls a 6 again, and it's another 6. Right, which one was it this time? Well, you'd be pretty certain now that you're going to be getting the 6-sided die. How do we calculate our probabilities? Each roll of the dice is independent, and that means that the results from one roll don't affect the results of the next roll. So we can simply multiply the probabilities to get the total probability. So Data's chance of rolling a 6 3 times in a row was 1 in 216. We can calculate what it would be to roll a 6 100 times in a row, which is getting to be a rather vanishingly small number. Okay. How does this relate to crystallography? We assume that our reflections are independent. This is an approximation, but it's a very good approximation for our purposes. So what is the probability of rolling a 6 from a 6-sided die 1 billion times? Let's ask the Star Trek computer, shall we? Inaccurate, data in error. Oh dear, didn't like that one. So let's have a different question, shall we? Let's ask, what is the logarithm of the probability of rolling a 6 from a 6-sided die 1 billion times? No problem, we get the answer. Well, that's all well and good, but how can we calculate the log of x without calculating x to start with before we take the log? Well, when our probabilities are built up as a product of probabilities, the log of the product is the same as the sum of the logs. So we don't need to calculate the total to start with.
Captain's log, additional.
Yes, that's right. Additional log. Now let's talk about optimization. If we're going to talk about the log of a function rather than the original function, is it legitimate to be optimizing our parameters with respect to a new function, the log of the function, rather than the original function? And the answer is yes. So logarithmic functions are monotonic functions, which means that if you optimize your parameters with respect to log x, you're optimizing them with respect to x as well. Computer algorithms are designed to minimize. So what we do is we optimize our parameters by minimizing the minus log likelihood.
All we can do now is minimize it.
Now we come to Bayes' theorem. If I put one 8-sided die and 8 10-sided die in a box and select a die at random and roll the die and tell you the result of the roll, then what die is the most likely that I selected? So now data's rolled a 4. Now if there was only an 8-sided and a 10-sided die in the box, we would immediately say that the 8-sided die was the more likely. But now we have a prior probability of selecting the 10-sided die that is much higher. And we can calculate the actual probability using Bayes' theorem, which turns the probability of the model given the data into the probability of the model times the probability of the data given the model for constant data probability. So we can work that out in terms of probabilities. The probability that we had a 10-sided die, given that we rolled a 4, is 8 in 90. But the probability that was the 8-sided die is only 1 in 72. So our 10-sided die is by far the most likely. In crystallography, the prior probability includes things like the model geometry terms, and the likelihood is our crystallographic experiment. So let's try playing another game. This game is slightly more complicated than the others. In the box, I've either got a 6-sided die or an 8-sided die, and either a 4-sided die or a 10-sided die. So it's 2 die, of which you don't know which either of them are directly. Now I'm going to see what happens when I roll the die. So now I've rolled a 3. So how do we work out which of the possibilities is the most likely die in this case? This is related to the problem of integrating out nuisance variables. So the probability that we had either a 6 or an 8-sided die, given that we rolled a 3, is the sum of the probabilities of the different options. And if we work through the mathematics for our 2 cases, our 2 options, then it turns out that it's slightly more likely that it was either the 4-sided or the 10-sided die that we selected from the box for that roll. But it's not obvious in this case. In crystallography, these unknown parameters are the way that we deal with our unknown phase, the phase problem phase. And lastly, the central limit theorem. So in this game, I have an unbiased 20-sided die, and I roll the die 100 times and take the sum of the values. And I do this 10,000 times, plotting the sum values for each game on a histogram. At the end, the histogram looks like a Gaussian. How do we use the central limit theorem? Well, our model has errors in the positions of the atoms and also in the completeness of the structure. So some of the atoms will be missing from our model. And those 2 errors have to be converted into an error in our structure factor. Now, because we have errors from lots of different sources, we can apply the central limit theorem, which means that our error distribution for our structure factor becomes a 2D Gaussian in the complex plane. The center of the Gaussian isn't at the full calculated structure factor position. It's shortened from that position by a factor d, which is between 0 and 1. It's always shortened because if it was longer, it would imply that we had increased the amount of scattering. And all that we have done is taken the same amount of scattering and we're uncertain about where it is. So if this is the equation for our two-dimensional Gaussian, offset from the origin by this term dfc, and with a variance term sigma delta squared, then this is our complex distribution between our phased f-obs and our phased f-calc. But of course, we don't have the phase of f-obs. This is our phase problem phase. So in order to turn our probability distribution into one that's for the unphased structure factors, we need to integrate out the phase. So if we sum around the origin, we build up a curve of this shape, which is known as a Rice distribution. And it has this form here, which is a negative exponential times a modified Bessel function of order 0, where negative exponential is this part of the curve that decreases, and the modified Bessel function is this part of the curve which increases, and it's the product of these two that gives us the Rice distribution. Now, instead of using f-calcs, we use normalized structure factors ease, because if we work in terms of ease, instead of having two parameters, which is the d and the sigma delta describing our distribution, we only have one parameter, which is the sigma a. And this is the sigma a that's key to our model errors in maximum likelihood. So now, as I promised, I hope you can see all the concepts that I've been talking about within this equation. So we have our data, which is the E effective and the D obs component. That's the data and the data errors. We also have our E calc, which is our model. This term of the exponential and the modified Bessel function is our Rice distribution, which comes about by integrating out the phase from a two-dimensional Gaussian centered on sigma A E calc. We have the log of this, our log likelihood, and the independence of reflections is the sum over all of the reflections. And most importantly, we have this sigma A term here, which is the model error by the central limit theorem. Now, the nice thing about the likelihood approach is that once you have the concepts, it's the same thing in different guises, in different situations. So the rotation function in phasor is conceptually the same, in that we have a two-dimensional Gaussian for which the phase has to be integrated out to give us our probability. But in this case, the unknowns are much greater because we only have the lengths of the structure factors of the components of the unit cell rather than their phased components as we would in a translation function. Conceptually similar in the likelihood function for the SAD phasing. This time we have a component that comes from the real part of the scattering, where the substructure is a very small part of the total scattering of the asymmetric unit. And then we have the more information from the anomalous component, and it's a combination of these two pieces of information that give us our likelihood function. I think I mentioned that one of the benefits of understanding this equation is that you wouldn't need to read the manual for phasor. And what I mean by that is that when you're presented with an interface to phasor with all of its options, you won't be confused because you'll be able to home in on the things that are important and understand what the GUI is trying to extract from you in the way of information. So for example, you will know that you should be using I's and sig I's for the data because that gives you the best E effective and D obs terms in the equation. You'll know not to truncate the resolution because you want to sum over as many reflections as possible to increase your signal. When it comes to model errors, you'll understand that you need a model that has low RMS and high completeness. And you'll understand that the completeness that the program needs is the completeness of the total number of atoms that are modeled within the asymmetric unit. I now want to just run through a few examples of the power of phasor statistics. So 11 things in 11 slides. Firstly, anisotropy correction. So anisotropy correction is the first thing that's done when data is read into phasor, and it's very important for calculating the E-values, the normalized structure factors. It commonly occurs in protein crystals when you have, for example, helices, where the packing in one direction in space is good, and then packing perpendicular is poor. Phasor upweights the weakly diffracting data and downweights the strongly diffracting data. And also included in that normalization process is correction of the sigmas of the data. So there's no need within phasor with the LRGI target to anisotropically truncate the data. Secondly, translational non-crystallographic symmetry. Now, translational non-crystallographic symmetry is when you have a component of the asymmetric unit that is related to an identical component of the asymmetric unit by a simple translation operation. And this can be a single vector, or as shown here, multiple vectors. In this case, we have 7 copies of the molecule related by the same vectors repeated. You can detect this before structure solution by looking at your native Patterson. Taking the information from the native Patterson and the initial estimate of the vector, we can correct the data modulations for translational non-crystallographic symmetry before structure solution. And again, this is important for calculating our normalized structure factors, our E-values, and when it's corrected, it makes a huge difference to the ability to solve the structure. Translational non-crystallographic symmetry tends to mask any twinning that you may have in your crystals because they have opposite effects on the intensity distribution of your data. So translational non-crystallographic symmetry forces the data into very intense and very weak subsets of intensities, whereas twinning tends to bring all of your structure factor intensities towards the mean. So the combination of the two can mean that you end up with a structure factor intensity distribution that looks completely normal. By correcting for the translational non-crystallographic symmetry, you can therefore unmask any twinning that may be present. And this twin analysis is done in phasor and gives you a p-value for your twinning. If you remember, I talked about the abject failure of trying to use Patterson correlation refinement in the structure solution for LIF in my thesis. Well, phasor has an updated version of the Patterson correlation refinement, which we call Gyre refinement. And that's the ability to refine the relative orientations of components within a structure before they're placed within the asymmetric unit, so when only their orientational component is known. And this is put to very good work in Archimboldo Shredder, where you can refine the orientations of fragments before going on to the translation function. One of the most important aspects of phasor is its ability to build up a structure from components. And this would have really helped in the structure solution of LIF that I talked about. So in my thesis, I had to find the 2 components of LIF in the asymmetric unit separately. And the second one was giving a very, very marginal signal. If I had been able to place the first molecule and then build on the structure solution by using that to help find the second molecule, I've no doubt that the solution would have been a lot clearer than it was. And in fact, you can show that as you're adding more and more components to your structure solution, the signal becomes clearer and clearer because the variance has been reduced every time you add a component. It's obviously important to know when you have solved your structure, but in the context of automation, it's even more important to have an objective criteria, because then you can make automated decisions within your pipelines about how to proceed at any given point. We've shown that an LRG of 60 is a very good indicator that you have solved your structure by molecular replacement. And this is independent of any other aspects of the problem. So the sequence identity of your model, the fraction scattering of your model, the completeness of your model. We've also shown that the LLG is related to the TFZ score, which we've long known has been a good indicator that you have a correct placement of a component. So a TFZ score of 8 and an LLG score over 64 or 60 is a really good indicator that you have solved your structure. Now that we have an objective measure for when we believe we have placed a component correctly by molecular replacement, that's an LLG of 60, can we work out under what circumstances we would be able to achieve an LLG of 60 and therefore a solution? And that comes about from the expected log likelihood gain, which is the probability weighted integral over all possible pairs of observed and calculated structure factors. And it's a very simple equation. It turns out to be sigma a to the fourth summed over all of the reflections. This estimate of sigma A is required, and that can be estimated from the fraction scattering and the RMS deviation. So together, this gives us the trade-off between our fraction scattering, the RMSD, and how that feeds through into our LLG. And for example, we can use that to rank models for molecular replacement or components for molecular replacement in advance of structure solution, and also provide some feedback as to whether this is going to be a tractable problem or not. The robust statistics behind maximum likelihood molecular replacement means that we can push the models for molecular replacement towards smaller and smaller fragments of the asymmetric unit, provided that we have a lot of reflections to compensate for the small fraction scattering. The advantage of using smaller fragments is that they tend to be able to be modeled locally as very low RMS deviation. So the combination of large numbers of reflections and low RMSs mean that you can extract a signal, even down to molecular replacement with a single atom. Why would you even attempt this? Well, you can be guided by the expected LLG. If you make assumptions about the most ordered and most strongly scattering atoms within the structure, if you have enough reflections, you can show that the expected LLG of your first atom is significant enough to be able to get some signal in a molecular replacement and bootstrap the full structure from that. The opposite problem is when you have too much data and molecular replacement is slowed down by having to handle so many reflections for large unit cells. In that case, we can safely truncate the resolution to just the data required to achieve a signal using the expected LLG to guide us, and that significantly increases the speed of molecular replacement solutions with, for example, the ribosome. 11thly, lastly, I want to tell you about the MR-SAD method. If you have SAD data with a poor anomalous signal, or accidental SAD data, for example, data from a native crystal collected at longer wavelengths, then it can be difficult to find the anomalous substructure from just the SAD data alone. However, if you remember the description of the SAD target function that I showed earlier, you might remember that the SAD function in phasor includes a component for the real scattering too. This means that you can seed your SAD phasing with atoms that are primarily real scatterers. So you can seed SAD phasing with a partial molecular replacement solution or a complete molecular replacement solution. The anomalous substructure and even the rest of the real structure can be found using log likelihood gradient maps. In fact, in single atom molecular replacement, after one or a few atoms are found by molecular replacement, the rest of the structure is completed with log likelihood gradient maps, not by molecular replacement. To make a log likelihood gradient map, phasor computes the derivative of the log likelihood with respect to the heavy atom or the light atom, for that matter, structure factor. The Fourier transform of this derivative gives a map of where the likelihood target would like to see changes in the scatterer model. So the peaks are where it wants more scattering, for example, a new site. It is very sensitive to minor sites, minor anomalous sites, which in SAD phasing, particularly when there are lots of minor sites, it really can bring your map up to a level of interpretability, adding all of these little minor sites. Another good thing is that it can pick up sites incorrectly identified as, say, water molecules in refined structures determined by halide soaks. And it can also help with element identification as well, because it uses the ratio of the real to imaginary scattering to help identify the element type of your sites. So it's a very useful method. Unfortunately, that's all I've got the time to tell you about the details of phasor functionality today. I've left out a lot of things. I've left out a lot of the details of SAD phasing, for example, and some of our recent work on the statistics behind SAD phasing. I've also left out all of the non-likelihood methods that are in phasor. But what I've aimed to do is give an overview of the methods that I think have contributed most to making phasor an advance over other methods. But before going on to talk about the future of phasor, it's worth just looking at the current trends or trajectory of phasing methods. So here's the growth of the PDB chart as this is the number of new structures in 5-year bins since around the time that phasor was first released in 2000. The structure determination method field within the PDB entry is a free text field, and therefore it's highly variable, but it does give some indication of the methods used in structure determination. And if we look in that field, we can see that there has been quite a significant shift in phasing methods over the last 20 years. Number-wise, it's interesting that the number of experimentally phased structures has not really changed. But since the total number of structures is going up as a fraction of the total, the fraction of experimentally phased structures is dropping. Within experimentally phased structures, the number of isomorphous replacement structures has gone down and SAD has gone up, and overall MR has gone up massively. Back in 2000, about 80% of structures were being solved by molecular replacement or difference Fourier methods. And by 2020, so at the end of this 5-year bin, this had gone up to 95% of structures by molecular replacement. So what's the barrier to molecular replacement cracking the other 5% of structures? Well, I think the barriers, whether real or perceived, were around the availability of low RMS models that covered a large enough fraction of the target structure, and the time-consuming process of generating and testing many different models. And that, of course, is where AlphaFold 2 and the similar methods developed by other groups since Caspar 14 really step in. At their best, these methods are able to provide highly complete lower RMS models for at least components of the asymmetric unit, which, as we have seen, can be used to build up a full structure. So the net result is to throw the problem back on the crystallography, whereas in the past we could say, well, this was never going to be solvable because your model is not going to be good enough. The model problem is now optimized. So the problems that are remaining in any given problem are going to be to do with the resolution of your data, the unit cell and the space group, and the fraction of the models in the asymmetric unit. Any other problems involving twinning or other pathologies will also play a role in your ability to solve the structure. So it all comes back to the crystallography. So if we go back to our holistic view of protein crystallography, what are the predictions for the phase problem now? Well, it's likely that more structures will be solved by molecular replacement, and the approach will be, give me another model to try, rather than give me another method to try. I think experimental phasing will become a niche method, and possibly rise in the use of MR-SAD for difficult cases. So part of the structure that can be solved with a good model will be contributing to finding sites in SAD data, which can be then used to bootstrap a difficult structure. Of course, the phase problem is not the only problem within this holistic view. In fact, the steps within this pipeline, as I have shown it, are more or less defined by the problems at each step. So there's a crystallization problem, a good data problem, and the R factor problem. And also, right at the beginning, the project problem. And I think all of these problems along the pipeline will be impacted by the availability of good predictions for models. So I have to tell you that after all of that, that Phaser has reached end of life. The code base reached the point where we couldn't go where we wanted to go with it. We couldn't explore more difficult and complicated phasing strategies based on the overall design of the Phaser software. So our developments have now shifted to a new code base, which is called Phaser TNG, and Voyager. The concept behind Voyager is that it inverts the focus of the coding. So where Phaser is software that operates to produce solutions that are generally read in log files, Voyager is conceptually the solutions that know their relationship to each other and configure the software for the action. And this allows us to have very flexible search strategies with complex branching. Phaser TNG contains most of the Phaser functionality that you know and love. The bits that have been jettisoned are archaeological code, but it's got a lot of new goodies as well, including a self-rotation function, and lots of functionality for cryo-EM docking, which is something else that I've not talked about at all. So the scope is ever expanding, but always in the context of automation and the ability to link this functionality easily, flexibly, and fast. So I'll finish on a bit of fun, I hope, because as you will see, I have decided to fully embrace the Star Trek theme with Voyager and Phaser TNG, to the extent of naming the Voyager protocols after Star Trek. Actually, I find this system quite useful because it really does help me remember which protocol is which quite easily. I'm going to leave a little screen recording of the running of Voyager in a little toy GUI that I made up for testing purposes, running up here in the top right-hand corner, just for you to look at as I talk. It's really just to give you an idea of where we're headed. So the first protocol is Scotty, which beams the structure straight out of the PDB if it detects that the data are already present in the PDB, and does a nice wide radius convergence refinement for you, fixing space group settings and so on. And here's the meme for it.
Captain, Scotty, beam us up fast.
The next is Nomad. Nomad takes whatever models you have dumped in a directory, which now will be various AlphaFold 2 models or similar, and which will have been broken down into rigid components. And this script builds the combinations that together cover the biological unit entered as a sequence. And here's the meme.
You are a biological unit. You are imperfect.
The next is Tricorder. This is for data analysis, which should be one of the steps that you use to analyze the data before you charge headlong into attempting molecular replacement.
A normal tricorder would never detect it.
Bones is basically a dry run of the molecular replacement protocol so that you can check on how widely it's going to explore and add limitations if there are things that you know in advance, which would perhaps help speed up the protocol.
McCoy here. Bones, hurry up with that report. Join me in the briefing room with your analysis.
And then the full molecular replacement strategy protocol is, of course, called Picard.
Make it so.
The MR SAD phasing protocol, which is still at an early stage of development, will be called Troy, obviously.
Are you feeling sad?
So I hope that's whetted your appetite for the things that are to come in Phaser, now Phaser TNG Voyager, and perhaps encouraged you to give it a go in your own structural biology projects. My most important acknowledgements are to Randy Reid, of course. It's been a partnership of 20 years working on shared ambitions and goals for what we're trying to achieve with Phaser. And I've thoroughly enjoyed meeting all of the challenges and enjoying the rewards as well of the project. Over the last 20 years, many people have contributed directly to the Phaser project, including Rob, Laurent, Gabor, Kaushik, Duncan, Anne, and Massimo and Claudia. Isabel's group in Barcelona have been leveraging Phaser in ways that we would not have thought possible. And Irasima, Massimo, and Claudia have all contributed to the Phaser project. Massimo and Claudia also contributed directly to Phaser by moving from Isabel's group to work with us in Cambridge. The Phoenix Consortium has been vital to the development of Phaser, and I particularly want to thank Nat, Pavel, Billy, Tom, and Ralph for directly contributing to the Phaser code. But really, the whole Phoenix Consortium, led by Paul Adams, has provided a very stimulating environment for the discussion of ideas and the general development of our software. For funding, I thank the Wellcome Trust for paying my salary through a Principal Research Fellowship to Randy Reid. I thank the BBSRC for funding through CCP4. I thank NIH for their funding through Phoenix, and also the contribution of the EU's Horizon 2020 programme, who funded a fellowship to Massimo Samito. And finally, because this is not the sort of talk that I normally get to give, I would also like to give 4 sets of acknowledgements that I don't normally get the chance to give. And those are to David and Elspeth for their ongoing support and encouragement, and also to my parents for their very wise words over the years. And thank you for listening.
Anna Tomczyk, thank you for a wonderful talk, and now we're going to open this for questions. So anyone who comes up to ask questions, please state your name first.
Hi, this is Jessica Bruin. So I'm working in the small molecule micro-ED world, and I actually end up solving a small amount of my structures using molecular replacement at Phaser. And I am wondering if you have any advice, or if you are moving at all in this direction of helping the small molecule world with these lower resolution data. Thanks.
Low resolution data?
1.1 angstroms, 1.2 angstroms. So I know it's all relative. Low to me.
Indeed.
I would rather, use ab initio methods.
Yeah, yes. Well, so we have our single atom molecular replacement method, which you can calculate your expected LLG and see if you can get a solution. If it's likely that you're possibly going to get a solution with the single atom molecular replacement, it does have the advantage that it accounts for error as well, which is the whole point of the maximum likelihood. We haven't had a case where we can say that it's definitely going to work and other methods aren't going to work, but I'd be very happy to hear how you go.
I'll check it out. Thanks.
So I've gone very quiet.
I think that's all for questions today. Thank you again to Airlie McCoy for a wonderful lecture, and congratulations for winning the Kenneth Patterson Award. Or, sorry, Trueblood Award. Sorry.
Thank you very much.